Welcome to the podcast from Module 14, Dada and Dreamscapes. In this podcast, we're going to be examining two art movements that arose in response to the cultural context of the 20th century. 20th century is going to be a time of great social and political upheaval. And the two movements we're going to look at were very much in reaction and responding to some of the changes and innovations happening in the 20th century. First, I'd like to set up kind of the context for these two movements with another movement, a very minor movement that mainly happened in Italy, something called Futurism. And we're only going to look at one example of futurist art. It's by Umberto Boccioni. It's called Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. It's a sculpture and it looks kind of cubist. You can see all the planes. And it also looks sort of like a hood ornament. And therein is kind of a key to what the futurists were all about. They were something of a political movement as well as an aesthetic movement. They basically believed that technology was a really good thing, and the faster and slicker the technology, the better. Their philosophy was very much out with the old and in with the new. In fact, they called museums sort of mausoleums or tombs, and they believed that sort of the cultural legacy of Europe, especially, was stagnant and stale, and what society really needed was another war. They believed war was a good thing, that war kind of cleanses societies, that it sort of burns out old stale thoughts and practices. And so, in addition to speed and technology, the futurists are going to glorify war, which sounds really stinking crazy to most of us, and certainly would sound utterly insane in just 2 or 3 years when World War I had started. In some ways, though, this was nothing more than an extreme expression of Enlightenment thought, a belief that rational, logical thinking, scientific progress, and advances in technology would always benefit society, that they would always make society better. A lot of people, especially at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, really believed that. They believed that society was getting better, that it was progressing, and our embracing of science and technology was a part of that. It's just the futurists believe that in a more extreme way. Most of that idealistic belief in science and reason sort of advancing us as a civilization was shattered in the trenches of the First World War. You see here the very machines and the very technology that was supposed to help us out as a society turned against us and became mass killing machines. Think about the machine gun, airplanes, tanks, barbed wire, poison gas. All of these products of science led to the killing of millions and millions of men, entire generations in European countries being wiped out. And for many people, this marked a loss of faith, not only in technology, but in the idea that scientific progress and reason and rational thinking were helping us get better as a civilization. Here's a painting by John Singer Sargent that to me really illustrates the tragedy of the First World War and how unglamorous it was. I should mention, by the way, that a lot of futurism as a movement did not last very long, and it ended up sort of evolving and being absorbed by fascism under Benito Mussolini. But many futurists, with their belief that war was a good cleansing thing, signed up for the army during the First World War, and many were killed. Back to this painting, though. This is by our old buddy John Singer Sargent. If you'll remember him, the guy who painted the portraits of rich society people. Sargent was an artist, sort of a military artist during World War I, and he sketched and painted a lot of images of life behind the front lines. And this is a massive painting. You can go see it at the Imperial War Museum in London. It's really big, really dramatic, and moving. It depicts a line of soldiers who have been blinded in a poison gas attack, perhaps mustard gas. and they are being led by an orderly to a first aid station. And they're surrounded basically by a sea of wounded people, many of them also blinded. Now, this painting is kind of a takeoff on an earlier painting by Peter Bruegel, a Renaissance artist, called The Blind Leading the Blind, which is from a parable that Jesus told in the Bible. So this painting definitely has sort of a resonance beyond its own time. And these are men who are young men, some in their teens and early 20s, who are faced with the prospect of spending the rest of their life blinded. And it shows that there's nothing glorious and glamorous about war, that it's just awful and brutal. And here's the detail from Gast. Notice that it was painted in 1918, just immediately upon the end of the war. So there's a certain freshness about this painting. Sargent was an American, and America did not lose just millions and millions of men in the First World War like other countries did. I think the war hit harder places like France and Great Britain and Germany. Here is a German artist, a work by a German artist named Otto Dix, Stormtroopers Advancing Under Gas, and it seems to get at the horror of trench warfare. We see German soldiers, one of them rearing back to throw a hand grenade, wearing their characteristic helmets and gas masks, and they've been turned into sort of unhuman specters or ghosts or machines. They seem totally robbed of their humanity as they march ahead through barbed wire and through a devastated landscape. Here's another Otto Dix painting from 1920 called The Scat Players, and just a really weird, bizarre, and horrifying painting that gets at some of the same themes as John Singer Sargent's painting, but in an even more brutal, cynical way. These are three veterans of World War One, and when this was painted, it was only a couple of years after the war had ended. And these men have all lost body parts in the war. And these body parts have been replaced by peg legs, by mechanical jaws, by masks, all sorts of kind of machinery. And now these men are half man, half machine. And this painting is just a brutal indictment of what war does to people. So we can see from this painting that the Allies were not the only ones who realized that war was terrible. Germany and also greatly suffered. And I just think this is a heartbreaking image. There's, if you look really closely in the lamp, there is a skull glowing, kind of like death presiding over this entire scene. So Dix and Sargent are creating this art after the war in response to it. But during the war, there was a group of artists, or perhaps they would call themselves anti-artists, who viewed the killing that was going on in Europe as kind of a collective world suicide. They were horrified by trench warfare and the casualties and the suffering that they witnessed. And they decided that since a faith in technology and reason and rational thinking had brought the world to this place, then the only proper reaction for hopefully the salvation of humanity was in irrationality, was in a lack of reason, and was in essence in absurdity. So a movement was formed around these ideas. This movement was called Dada, and Dada is perhaps best described as an anti-art movement. Absurdity was the order of the day in Dada. Some said Dada wasn't even really any sort of movement, it was a state of mind. And it's basically a collective, mostly of artists, but also poets, who would create kind of crazy sculptures and collages and do strange performance events, trying to wake up the world to the insanity of World War One and the way that humans were killing each other on this massive scale. And again, it's all about sort of saving humanity by rejecting reason, by rejecting rationality, or so they thought. A typical Dada get together might include some very, very strange things. There might be a girl in a white communion dress reciting obscene poetry. There might be people running around barking like dogs. There might be folks reciting gibberish language that doesn't make any sense. In fact, the whole name Dada, according to the story, was chosen completely at random. Supposedly, the Dadaists opened a French German dictionary randomly to a page and pointed to a word, and the word they pointed to was Dada, which is a French word for a child's rocking horse. And they loved the random absurdity of that. And so that became the name of their movement. Let's look at some of the work of these Dada artists or anti artists, whatever you want to call them. The one that's probably best known is Marcel Duchamp, who did a lot of his Dada works in the United States, in New York City. He is most famous for this sculpture that we've already seen called Fountain. Do you remember this? This is the urinal that he signed with a fake name. Duchamp pioneered the concept of ready-mades. This is the name he gave to objects that he would find and then present as art objects. He would claim that he simply created a new idea for the object. The fountain piece, the urinal, was actually something he entered in a show that claimed it would be willing to display every single artwork that was entered. That was kind of the main parameters of the show. If you entered something, it would be shown. So he decided to test the limits of art rather mischievously by entering this urinal just to see if it would pass as art. And it got rejected, and in getting rejected, became really famous. Here's another one of Duchamp's ready-mades. He took a bicycle wheel and drilled a hole in a stool and stuck the bicycle wheel into the stool. And that's it. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't even really look pretty. Both of these are very unaesthetic objects. But that is very Dada kind of thing to do, to create, to sort of celebrate absurdity and to celebrate something that doesn't work. There's kind of this strain of humor and mischief that runs through Dada, although it is in many ways a very serious movement reacting to the horrors of World War I. There's also the absurdity kind of leads into whimsy and comedy sometimes. This next image is a great example of that. It's called LHOOQ, and it is a reproduction of Leonardo's Mona Lisa, on which he has drawn a crazy mustache and a goatee, and that's it. So there's this subversion, right? This turning traditional great art on its head, making fun of it, making fun of artistic convention. That is very playful, and that is very Dada. This next piece is another great illustration of Dada absurdity. It's by Jean Arp. It's called Collage with Squares Arranged According to the Laws of Chance. And Arp basically tore some squares out of blue and white paper and then dropped them and let them fall randomly on another sheet of paper. And everywhere they fell, he glued them down. So this is an entirely random composition. Remember, it's kind of like how the Dadaists chose their name by randomly choosing a word in the dictionary. They loved random chance things. And as you look at this, I kind of have a sense that he probably cleaned it up a little bit because it's almost like in a grid pattern. All the squares seem to be oriented in a similar way, so he probably did a little bit of cleanup. It's probably not entirely chance. Now, Dada was a worldwide movement. Arp was Swiss, Duchamp was a Frenchman working in the United States, and even German artists were in on the act trying to use absurdity to highlight how insane the world had gone. And one of these German artists was Hannah Höch. She was known for a technique called photomontage. This is a Dada invention. If the Cubists invented paper collage, the Dadaists went a step further, and they actually cut out photographs and typography and would arrange them together in interesting, often absurd compositions. Compositions that contain visual contradictions and really strange juxtapositions. And Hannah Höch was great at this. This is one of her works. Has one of the longest titles in all of the art world. It's called Cut with the Dada Kitchen Knife Through the Last Weimar Beer Belly Cultural Epoch. This is a scathing critique of Germany, especially its political state. It's full of all sorts of Dada absurdity. In fact, you can see the word Dada repeated several times over and over. And she'll do things like put the heads of famous political leaders on the bodies of exotic dancers. Just strange, subversive things that highlight kind of the political commentary of Dada. While Dada is a revolutionary movement, it is nonetheless rather short-lived. Most of the Dadaists kind of join another art movement that comes along, which is an ism, yet another one of our isms, surrealism. And they're very sort of compatible art movements. Surrealism is a lot less political than Dada. But surrealism is an art movement that is basically obsessed with the subconscious and the world of dreams. During this time, the early 20th century, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung had both proposed theories about the way our minds work. And Sigmund Freud believed that our subconscious and our dreams contained a lot of truth about who we are. Freud would argue that basically our unconscious sort of motivations drive who we are as people. We're not even aware of the forces that are acting on us because those forces are all sort of below the surface of our consciousness. Jung contended that all of us have a collective subconscious, that there are embedded in us subconscious ideas and archetypes that are shared with every single human being that has ever lived, that we're all sort of bound together by this shadowy world of the subconscious. And both of these psychoanalytical theories are going to emerge in the early 20th century. And just a couple of examples, right, of the revolutions in thought that are happening during this time. And these ideas are very much going to influence artists. And these artists are reading Freud and Jung and they're saying, you know, if the subconscious is so important and the subconscious is what's really driving my actions, then as much as possible, I need to tap into the subconscious in order to make art because that is getting most in touch with the truest part of myself. So the Surrealist art movement goes about trying to create artworks that are somehow guided by the unconscious, subconscious, or irrational parts of the human psyche. They, in many cases, are going to try to make art without exerting any rational control. Now, the links to Dada are kind of hopefully pretty obvious here. This rejection of rational thought and logic, and also some of the random activities of Dada, such as dropping those pieces of paper and gluing them down wherever they fall. That sort of activity is very compatible with the Surrealists because they want to use chance and randomness as much as possible. Because the Surrealists believe that the more you let go of control, the more you're tapping into the truest parts of yourself. So, Surrealism as an art movement is built basically around the dream world, around dreamscapes. Let's look at some examples of Surrealist art. The first thing I want to show you is simply a drawing. It's by an artist named André Masson, and it is what is called an automatic drawing. This is the type of drawing in which the artist takes a pen and simply begins to move it upon the paper with no conscious plan, with no sort of composition intended, just completely randomly. And basically, the artist is trying to let the subconscious do all the work. And if you've ever tried that, you might try it sometime. It's a pretty hard thing to do, to be totally unplanned and completely random in making marks. So again, you can see, hopefully, the relationship between this and Dada, this concept of randomness and spontaneity and trying to get in touch with your irrational self. Now, Surrealism as an art movement kind of falls into two categories. The first is called biomorphic surrealism, the second is called naturalistic surrealism. Biomorphic surrealism is kind of like that automatic drawing thing. Um, the artists who do surrealism in this way are creating these kind of crazy shapes and images and lines that are abstract and but they're trying to release conscious control from, for example, constructing a coherent story or a coherent composition. At some point, of course, if you have artistic instincts, you'll probably uh, just naturally gravitate towards making compositions balanced and colors good and that sort of thing. But the biomorphic surrealists are still trying to let go of as much control as possible. So let's check out some examples of biomorphic surrealism. We're really just going to look at different examples from one artist named Jean Miro. Miro is someone who creates these random shapes with as little conscious thought as possible. He kind of starts moving his paintbrush and lets the painting kind of guide him in what direction it should go. Here's our first example, Nocturne from 1940. You can see kind of a goofy looking, almost alien kind of character. Over on the right hand side, we see uh, something that almost looks like the head of a dog, kind of floating in the upper middle of the picture. All these crazy shapes and little sparkly things. You get a sense that he has not planned this out. He's just started working and let kind of the painting unfold as he goes along. Here's another example, Catalan landscape. Miro is a Spanish painter, so this seems to be very much influenced by his homeland. And again, kind of the crazy shapes. There are these eyeball motifs that often appear in Miro. And Miro would say this type of painting is getting in touch with the truest part of myself. This is more authentic than if I were trying to exert conscious control over a composition. And here's one last example called Dutch Interior 1. Again, the random blobby shapes, the sense that this thing is just sort of emerging as the artist goes along. There are some things we can pick out. There's what appears to be kind of like a dog uh, in the lower left, maybe some figure holding a musical instrument in the middle. But this is beyond the analysis of cubism. This has gone into total irrationality. We're not really sure what's supposed to be happening in this. What's most important is that the artist is, as closely as possible, following the dictates of his subconscious, making decisions, and he's not really sure why he's making these artistic decisions. He's just making them up as he goes along. Now, the second kind or second vein of surrealism is called naturalistic surrealism. And this is a type of surrealism that is more realistic, as you might guess. Objects appear to be more three dimensional. They're not these flat, blobby forms we see in biomorphic surrealism. Often the compositions are more planned. The artist might do some painting on location or gather some photo reference. But the imagery is still irrational. It's still the stuff of dreams. So let's check out some of this art. Perhaps the foremost practitioner of it is the Spanish painter Salvador Dali, who was quite a colorful character, and he was also quite a painter. He had a lot of painting skill. He was able to render things extremely realistically, but he chose to use this skill in service of surrealism to create these irrational images. Here's his most famous from 1931. It's called The Persistence of Memory. It's actually a very small painting. He's painting with really tiny brushes here. But let's just examine the imagery here. We have all of these clocks that are floppy and melting and dripping. They're not rigid like clocks and watches normally are. We have to the left a stopwatch or pocket watch, and ants are crawling all over it and devouring it. We have some sort of form lying flat on the ground that looks like parts of a head. We maybe see eyelashes and part of a nose. Uh, we're not really sure what this is about. It seems to be saying something about relativity, about the impermanence and flexibility of time, but it's unclear. It is a dreamy landscape, but look at how realistically it's painted, insofar as you can paint a realistic world of soggy clocks. Look, for example, at the background. We have those cliffs and some water in the sky. all that is pretty convincingly handled. One thing about naturalistic surrealism, I mean, it's weird. It seems like some sort of drug trip, uh, but it's at least fun to look at, even as you scratch your head. Here's another Dali painting, Meditation on the Harp. I have no idea what the title of this painting has to do with the subject, but what is the subject? There's some sort of figure whose elbow morphs into a whale skull that is being supported by a stick coming out of the ground. He has a really huge foot and a really regular foot, and he looks at these kind of amorphous figures that are amongst the clouds. I just kind of want to say, what the heck, and move on. Here's another Dali painting, The Metamorphosis of Narcissus. I can at least unpack some of the symbolism in this. Narcissus was a figure from mythology. It was a young man who thought he was very handsome, and he loved gazing at his own reflection, and he would spend uh, just hours and hours sitting on the banks of a stream looking at his own beautiful face in the reflection of the water. And the gods turned him into a flower that we know today as the narcissus flower, which is often found near water. So here in this painting by Dali, we have two sort of parallel sets of shapes. On the left-hand side, we seem to have a humanoid shape. It's a figure with its head on its knee and an arm bent at the elbow, the head down. It's gazing into the water. And on the right-hand side, we have an assortment of shapes that mimic that body to the left. These shapes, however, form sort of a hand. Do you see it? It's a hand that has a thumb and a forefinger, and it's holding an egg. And out of this egg sprouts a narcissus flower. So this is not just, I mean, it's really bizarre imagery, but this was at least a planned composition. I mean, you have to plan out this sort of thing if you're going to make a hand look like a body. Again, really impressive painting skill is being brought into play in all of Dali's works. He's very meticulous and quite the craftsman. Here's another Dali work, The Living Still Life. An alternate title for this is Fast Moving Still Life. We have some objects that might make up a typical still life that you might see, say, in a Dutch still life painting, except none of these objects are holding still. They're all moving around. They're floating. There are pieces of fruit flying around like comets. There is a hovering knife. Everything seems like it's in free fall. So really bizarre, strange imagery that is meticulously painted. This might be a good time to mention, if you haven't gathered already, that Salvador Dali was a pretty weird guy. Um, and he painted weird things, but he also carefully crafted his image into that of an eccentric artist. He had some quirky things he would do, almost like performance art. For example, he lectured at an art school with his foot in a pail of milk and boiled lobster on his head. Another time, he gave a lecture on art while wearing a diving suit, one of those old school deep sea diving suits, that has the big metal helmet on it. And he began to lecture, and nobody could really hear him, but everybody thought it was awesome because it was so surreal. And he began to run out of air and began to suffocate as he was talking to people. And he was thrashing his arms around, begging people to take off the helmet. But everybody was applauding, thinking it was part of the show. And eventually, somebody did take off the helmet. Dali was also someone whose life was guided in part by superstitions and phobias. Supposedly, he carried around a piece of driftwood he thought was magic with him at all times. So, a really colorful character. And he really played up his eccentric image. And I think he was also a pretty astute marketer of his image. Towards the end of his life, interestingly, he became Catholic, or at least got more into Catholicism than he was, and he churned out several religious pictures in a surrealist style. Let's look at some of those. Here is his crucifixion, Corpus Hypercubus, where Christ is crucified floating on this strange geometric shape that seems like a cross. And in the bottom left of the picture is a woman that's actually Dali's wife. She modeled for him, who gazes up at the body of Christ. Here is his Christ of St. John of the Cross, in which Christ, this is actually was based on a little sketch supposedly made by the mystic St. John of the Cross, who lived many years before Dali. And in this picture, Christ is suspended on the cross, but there are no nails and there's no blood. It's a strangely clean crucifixion, and we look down almost as if from a God's eye perspective on the body of Christ, and the cross pointing down towards a lake, perhaps the Sea of Galilee, with a boat on it. Here's another one of Dali's paintings from his Catholic phase, the Madonna of Port Ligat. And there, Mary, the mother of Jesus, sits in the midst of this sort of severed architecture that floats around her. In the background, we have angels with their arms extended. And in Mary's body, there is a cutout rectangle uh, in which is framed the baby Jesus, who himself has a cutout rectangle in his body. And here you can see a detail of that. And floating inside the cavity or the hollow in the body of the young Christ is a piece of bread, reminding us of communion and Christ giving the bread to his disciples and saying, "Take this, this is my body." Dali seems to be very literally illustrating that in his painting. And he also seems to be literally showing that Mary carried the Son of God within her when she was pregnant with Jesus. So theologically, I think this is a pretty interesting painting. Let's look at the work of another naturalistic surrealist. This is a Belgian artist named Rene Magritte. Kind of like Dali, his work is a lot of fun to look at. Magritte specializes in visual puns and jokes. He tends to be, in some ways, more realistic than Dali in terms of his images seem somehow uh, more conceivable. In fact, often when you first look at a Magritte image, everything seems normal and everything seems correct. And then you see something is kind of weird, something's off in his painting. So here's our first example. It's called Perspective, Madame Recamier. And here we have sort of a sofa. And on this sofa sits a coffin, bent as if it were a person sitting on the sofa. So, and again, pretty realistically painted. This is actually based on an image by our old buddy Jacques-Louis David, an image from over 100 years earlier. Madame Recamier, it's just a portrait that David did, and you can see Magritte copied a lot of the same elements, the sofa, the lampstand, for example, and the pose of the woman, except he replaced the woman with a bent coffin. What is Magritte saying? Is he saying that the old ways of doing art are dead? That museums, maybe like the futurists would say that museums are just mausoleums or tombs or repositories for the dead? Or is he just being funny? Here's another Magritte piece that is actually rife with perhaps psychological meaning. It's called The Treachery of Images, and it's a painting of a pipe, and under it is a French phrase, "Ceci n'est pas une pipe," which translates to, "This is not a pipe." So what do you think? Is that an accurate statement? I mean, I look at that and I think, well, of course it's a pipe, you know? But if you think about it, it's not a pipe. It's a picture of a pipe. So this calls into question the whole concept of art as a picture of something. It's not actually that thing. Art is always an illusion. And this rather witty work by Magritte kind of brings that into uh, front of our consciousness. Here's another work called Not to be Reproduced. A man gazes at a mirror over a mantle, and his own reflection turns away from him. This is a mirror that apparently refuses to reflect things back at people. So this definitely seems like the kind of imagery that would be yanked from a dream. You look in a mirror and you never see your face, you only see the back of your head. And here's one of Magritte's most famous images. It's called The Son of Man, which is a title that Jesus used for himself. Kind of a mysterious title for this painting. A man in a bowler hat and a suit stands apparently in front of an ocean, and a green apple floats in front of his face. This is actually a portrait of the artist himself, although we can't really tell because he's got an apple in the middle of his head. And if you look really closely, you can see his eyes just peeking around the apple. More Magritte. I just can't help myself. Magritte is so much fun to look at and play around with. This is called The Human Condition. In this painting, we see an open window with an artist's easel in front of the open window. The artist's easel contains a canvas. You can see the edge of the canvas right there, the white strip that has a little brass tacks in it. And painted on the front of the canvas is a scene that exactly matches and lines up with the landscape. It's almost like an invisible canvas. Um, and again, kind of like the pipe piece, The Treachery of Images, this particular painting calls into question of what is real, and do paintings really reproduce reality? And we will end our foray into surrealism on this very bizarre painting called The Portrait. And at first glance, everything looks normal. You've sat down to dinner, you have your bottle of wine. Remember, this is France, not ACU. And you have your silverware, and you have a plate. And on that plate is a piece of ham. And whoa, there's an eye in the piece of ham looking out at me. That's kind of strange. Is this a portrait of a piece of ham? Is it a portrait of an eye? What is going on here? Well, we may never know, because the idea here is to embrace the irrationality of the image. And that is certainly one of the big things that the surrealists are all about. So as we wrap up, I hope you've been able to see some common threads between Dada and surrealism. They're both reacting to events and ideas of their time. They are both sort of all about getting away from the way we've been doing things for hundreds of years, especially getting away from rational thought. Both of these movements would see truth and, to some degree, salvation being in irrationality and absurdity.